Well, good morning. It's great to get started with you this morning in this series, My Family and Our Bumpy Road. We started this series last week, and we were talking about the idea and the metaphor of a bumpy road. We've all been on bumpy roads before, and if you're a passenger and you're a kid, it's exciting. It's like, wee, bumpy road. If you're an adult, you're like, oh, no, bumpy road. And you're thinking about your car and the damage your car is going to take. But there's this point when you're on a bumpy road for long enough that it goes from fun to then you're thinking about your vehicle. Is my vehicle okay taking all this shock? And then at some point it transitions to not so much the road and not so much the vehicle, but you're concerned for yourself because what was a nuisance at first now is creating nausea. And you're like, oh, I'm going to get sick. I need some Dramamine. Then maybe your back hurts and your neck hurts. And it's not so much that we have a problem with the road. Here's our problem. It's what the road does to us. And we've been using this as a visual for marriage and family. It's not so much that the road is bumpy or the challenges that we have with our kids or the challenges that we have with our spouse or whatnot. It's what it does to us. Because we find ourselves maybe a little more short-fused than we used to be. Find ourselves maybe a little more critical than we used to be. We find ourselves maybe a little more miserly than we used to be. We find ourselves changing in the process, and that's part of the frustration is this bumpy road isn't just tough on our marriage and tough on our kids. This bumpy road is tough on me, and it's challenging me. Last week, we pushed into the idea of our marriage and the bumpy road of marriage, and we had some just fantastic feedback that we received all week long about the talk. And if you missed it, we'd love to have you listen online on our website. But we talked last week about this myth that some of us have, or some people have, that if I were in a better scenario, a perfect scenario, then maybe I wouldn't have so many bumps. And we pushed into the story of Adam and Eve, and we established two things from them. That one, they sinned, and they had conflict and tension, even amongst perfect environments. And the tendency is to think that if we had a better home, or we lived in a better neighborhood, or if I had a better job, or we had better in-laws, or we had better this, or we had better that we'd never fight. And that's just a myth. That there's a perfect environment that will create a bump-free road. And we looked at them also and said that one of the first things they did when they had the bumps and the tension is they went to covering and blaming. They went to covering themselves and blaming one another. They sinned and they saw something instantly in one another that they had not seen before. That happens all the time in marriage where you see something in your spouse that you had never seen before. I had never seen that side of you, or I never saw that aspect of how you would parent. And sometimes it causes didn't anticipate that. And we tend to cover and blame one another. And so we pushed in the idea, how do we get through that? How do we resolve conflict and not create so many fights within a family? And we said that there's kind of a conflict myth out there that I have to fight just because I'm right. And that's really a myth. That's wrong. And we fight too much. And we said when conflict does come to our family or to our marriage, two really important questions to ask. And I think these questions are helpful for all of us. And the first, as you see on the screen, is this fight helpful or necessary? While that seems real generic, I think it was incredibly helpful to say, is this conflict, is this tension, is this point even helpful or necessary for our family, or can we move past it? And the second question, I got to tell you, we had lots of buzz all week from this question. What would a great spouse do? Because in the middle of a fight, here's the tension. In the middle of a fight, you don't feel like a great spouse. When we're vacationing and everybody's happy, everybody's opened their gifts at Christmas and everybody's happy, we feel like a great spouse. But when there's conflict and when there's tension over whatever element, we don't feel like a great spouse. And it's a really important question in that moment to ask the question, well, what would a great spouse do here? How would they handle this situation? And really, really helpful question for us. Well, today what I want us to do is I want to pull the lens back, and I want to use this question, what would a great spouse do, maybe frame it as what would a great parent do? What would a great parent do in this situation? And we pull the lens back a little bit, and we want to look at the whole family and the bumpy road that sometimes we have. Now, I know in a room this size, we have a number of different types of families. We have parents with kids. We have married people that are awaiting kids, praying for kids. We have married people that maybe have adopted kids or are foster parents. We have plenty of people that you have adult kids and they have their own kids, so you're grandparents. Sometimes we have blended families. Sometimes we have singles who are a family of one, and I'm anticipating a family. I think what we're going to talk about today is helpful for all of us, no matter what the context is that we're coming from. Now, for me personally, my family, most of you know my dynamic. This coming September, my wife and I will have been married 20 years. We've got 4 kids. My son is 15. I've got twin girls that are 13 and then an 11-year-old daughter. I don't know tons about family, but I know a few things. And in the context of my job, I get to hear lots of stories. Anytime that we talk about family, my kids kind of cringe because they're thinking, Dad's going to tell another one of our stories, and they're not in service right now. So, but I'm not going to tell one of their stories. I figured I'm going to give them a break. I'm going to tell somebody else's story. I'm going to share somebody else's dysfunction. And so maybe today, if you hear these stories of dysfunction, you'll look at your family and say, hey, we are not doing that bad. We're doing okay. Did you hear that? So I'm going to give you 4 stories, 4 families. These are not TV families. These are real families, 4 families. And some of their dysfunction. Now, let me throw this caveat to you. They do not attend Bridgeway, and they won't be listening. So you can take a big sigh of relief. He's not talking about us, honey, 4 real families and their scenario. The first family is this. Have you ever seen a family or a married couple that got married too quick? They got married young. This couple got married young, and they got married real young. And because of that, it created all kinds of issues for them. They didn't really have a model to look at and say, I don't know what we're doing. They were just young. And along the way, they had a couple of kids, and as they were working their issues out, their kids had issues because the parents had issues. And they had these 2 primary boys that were very, very different from one another. One of these sons was really, really straight-laced. He was your organized. He was your orderly. If you said clean up your room, he not only did clean up the room, but he vacuumed, he dusted, he did all that kind of stuff. Then there was the other one. And the other one was kind of a corner cutter. He was kind of the, I don't want to do it everybody's way, buck the system, blame everybody, resist. And because of that, that created some family tension. And as the parents are getting older and kind of learning some things and developing, the problem was these 2 brothers kind of had some issues with one another. And true story, there came a point that their differences became conflict, and that conflict got really sideways. And on one day, the brother that kind of was more edgy, gritty, corner cutter, ended up escalating their conflict and literally took his brother's life. And obviously, it just mortified the family, devastated everybody, divided, and all kinds of mess. High levels of dysfunction. Another family that I think about was parents. Have you ever watched parents who show favoritism to their kids? And they say, no, we don't show favoritism, but they do, and it's obvious to everybody. It's like, you like that kid better than the others. That was kind of the case in this family. But it was interesting because it's not so much that they favored just one kid. Each parent favored somebody else. And mom favored one son who was, he was more your orderly type, but he was an inside kid. He was not your outside kid. He was a gamer. He was the one that just stayed inside but kind of manipulative, kind of sketchy. But he was an inside guy. The dad favored more the outside kid, kind of rugged, gritty football player type, calloused hands type kid. And because of that favoritism, it kind of divided the marriage where, why do you favor him? Well, why do you favor him? And because of it, it kind of rolled over into the kids. And that dysfunction played out to one day, the kid that was more the inside guy, he ended up just abandoning the home, left the home, moved out, went on his own way. And that created all kinds of marriage issues and kind of sad story because they never did holidays together from that point forward. Never did birthdays together from that day forward. They just became a divided family. I think of another family And I don't know if you've ever watched adults kind of get sideways with one another, like adult siblings, brother versus brother type scenario. But this family, they were in this organization. They led this organization together. And, there's kind of this mantra out there, don't do business with family or don't do ministry with family because of how sideways things get. Well, that was this family. And you have one brother who's kind of leading the organization. And by default, it creates all kinds of jealousy and power plays between older brother and sister and all that kind of stuff. And they end up having tension with one another. And the sister actually on one day kind of tries to turn a number of the people with her against him, and that creates all kinds of sideways conflict. And then another brother, one of the brothers fights the brother kind of in charge, and they kind of have this back and forth. And no matter how well the organization was going, there's always this underlying tension, when they're together, holidays, dinners at night, that kind of thing. There's this underlying tension. Why are you in charge of me? Who do you think you are? And it just created all kinds of sideways stuff for them. I'll give you one last family. And this family, the dad was very, very famous. In fact, you know him. I won't say his name, but this guy, very famous. And but that fame created all kinds of tension at home. If you've ever grown up knowing somebody famous, you wonder if they're the same person at home that they are on the stage, so to say. And this guy, because of his fame, lots of that fame came to him really early on, created all kinds of tension. He ended up abandoning his wife, left her. She really didn't do anything to cause it, but he left her for a period of years. It did all kinds of crazy dysfunction for her and the family, and when he came back, things were never right. We're never on par. And truth be told, he ended up having a few different kids with a few different women, so all kinds of weird stuff there. And but he was still able to kind of protect some image. And because of it, he was well respected by some of the kids because of his fame and what he did and served. And then he was also despised and resented by some of the kids in the home. So that was some of their dysfunction. Now, here's why I say all this. You probably know these families. You've probably heard about these families. The first family, the people that got married way too young, that's Adam and Eve. They got married when they're 2, They get married really young. They have no model to point at. They have no model to see. How do you resolve husband-wife conflict? How do you do this kind of thing? And their boys, Cain and Abel, get into conflict and one kills the other. The next couple, the one that showed obvious favoritism, that's Isaac and Rebekah. Isaac really strongly favored Esau, and Rebekah really strongly favored the other twin son, Jacob. And that ended up polarizing the family. Jacob ends up leaving one day, leaves the family, and they're not reunited till after parents are deceased. That created all kinds of tension for them. The family that was a mess because of this adult sibling stuff would have been Moses, Aaron, and Miriam. Moses is leading the organization of the Israelites, so to say, and Aaron's there thinking, well, hey, what about me? I'm kind of a leader too. Miriam's thinking, what about me? I'm kind of a leader too, and created all kinds of issues there within their family. The last one would have been King David. King David is this incredible king for Israel, but if you look at his family life, you strip away all of the surface stuff, he had all kinds of jacked up family stuff. He had all kinds of dysfunction with kids. One kid kills another kid, and it creates all kinds of inner turmoil, ends up creating a civil war in Israel because of it. Really, really bad stuff. Now, here's why I push into that. Because when you read the scriptures, as holy and perfect as the scriptures are, I think it's important and helpful in your family and parenting and marriage to pull back and recognize that these holy and perfect scriptures happen amidst lots of family type dysfunction. Like, I could do this all day. I could go from Abraham and Sarah. Abraham ends up lying about his wife and saying that she's his sister because he fears for his own life, ends up kind of relegating her to what could have potentially been some enslavement. You have Lot and his family. They're literally changed by the culture that they choose to be in, and their kids can't get out of that culture. And as parents, we wonder, is it safe sending my kids to junior high? Is it safe sending my kids to high school? Am I making the right decisions as a parent because of the culture? Lot and his family, they're living that, and they have the dysfunction of it, and they can't even keep their family on point with the Lord. You have Jacob and his sons. He ends up having some sons that sell off and slave one son named Joseph, and they lie to their dad about it for decades. For decades, their dad is in absolute sorrow, and they just lie about it continually to cover it up. You could look at Solomon. Solomon has all kinds of issue with his kids and with his wives, numerous wives, so he makes a ton of crazy decisions. You have Hosea. Hosea is a prophet in the entire nation, and his wife goes off and has children with other men. She ends up finding herself amidst prostitution, and God tells Hosea, hey, I want you to go get your wife. I want you to go love her still. I mean, imagine the tension with that. I'm a public figure, and I've got a wife that's literally, this isn't metaphor for something, she's having babies with other people. And I've got to receive that, and I've still got to love her, and the tension of that. You roll over into the New Testament. In the New Testament, you see family challenges and family issues. One of the easy things is to look at the disciples and just think that they're evangelists, that they just do ministry. But you got to recognize that the disciples, they had families too. For instance, it says this in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 and verse 3 says, Paul is saying, depicting something, he says, this is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? And then he says this, don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brothers and Cephas? Cephas was Peter. Or is it only I and Barnabas who must work for a living? He's simply saying they have families. Now push into that. Think about it. I mean, let's just kind of cup of coffee today. Let's just talk around the table. Imagine that you're doing some kind of ministry work that God's called you into, and it's not, your persecution isn't that people make fun of you. Your persecution isn't that people talk down of you. Your persecution is they might kill you, and they might kill your family, and you're dragging your spouse and your kids along for that road. I imagine there was probably inner turmoil and conflict and challenges. I imagine that they had a lot of bumpy roads along the way in pursuing calling. And they're called by God to do this. Here's what I'm pushing on. One of the easiest things for you and me to do when we have bumpy roads in our marriage or bumpy roads with our parenting, our kids are our bumpy road, my son's my bumpy road, my daughter's my bumpy road, my whole family's my bumpy road, or I'm their bumpy road, the tendency is to pull back and say, why even try? Or if I was in a different family, or if I had different kids, or if I had a different spouse, we wouldn't have so many bumps. And I just don't think that's accurate thinking. This morning, what I want to do is just kind of give three very simple baseline truths. As you see in your notes, three baseline truths. And a baseline truth is simply this. It's a starting point of comparison. It's a starting point to think about something and to build off of something. And so here's our first one. Fill this in. Having bumpy roads does not mean that God is not with you. Now, if you look at your sheet, hopefully you grabbed sermon notes on the way in. If you look at your sheet, before you filled in does not mean that, you had a blank. You had, having bumpy roads, blank, God is not with you. And the tendency is to want to fill that in with a word like indicates, means. Having bumpy roads indicates God is not with you. And you look at the fact that we fight. I fight with my junior high, or I fight with my high schooler, or I fight with my brother, or I fight with my parents, or I fight with my spouse. We have tension. The tendency is to think because I have bumpy roads, blank, it indicates that God is not with us. And I just think that that's furthest thing from the truth. I think that when we look at the scriptures, we have a comprehensive perspective that God uses families that are on bumpy roads, and he's with them in the midst of it. So if you have a bumpy road, it doesn't mean that God isn't there. It doesn't mean he's absent. It doesn't mean that he's inactive in the family. We've got to understand a few things. And I want to give you just a very simple nugget, parents. If you're like, man, Joel, we fight. I mean, my son and I, we fight. Or my daughter and I, she drives me nuts. I want to give you a verse that might help you. It takes some legwork on your side. 2 Timothy chapter 1. 2 Timothy chapter 1, verse 12 says this. That is why I'm suffering as I am. And you might say, amen, I'm suffering. Yet I'm not ashamed because, and there's two parts I want you to underline or circle in your notes. I want you to circle this next part where it says, I know whom I have believed. Circle, I know whom I have believed. And then it continues, and I'm convinced that, and then I want you to circle this next phrase. He is able to guard what I've entrusted to him. He is able to guard what I've entrusted to him for that day. Two parts that you want to pull out of this. When there's tension, I feel like I'm suffering. I feel like we have conflict. Two parts that we're pulling out. This first part, I know whom I have believed. I know in God. Like I look at my family and the tension, but I'm not going to lose hope and I'm not going to lose sound mind over that because I know whom I have believed. I'm trusting God. I can't get my son to comply. I can't get my daughter to comply. I can't get my husband to comply. Can't get my wife to comply. I can't get them to comply. But I know whom I have believed. I'm going to start with my relationship with God. And secondly, that he is able to guard. He's able to guard what I've entrusted to him. Like I can't control my junior hire's decision, but I can entrust them to the Lord. I can't control my adult son who's living in a different city, but I can entrust him to the Lord in prayer. I can't control what my spouse does or thinks, but I can continue to entrust them to the Lord in prayer. The legwork is that I've got to do a lot of praying for my family, but I start on this anchor point that just because we have bumpy roads doesn't mean that God isn't with us, but I'm going to lock into whom I have believed, and I'm going to lock into this confidence that he is able to guard that which I entrust to him. So I'm yielding my family. I'm yielding my family members to him. I'm yielding myself to him. I'm entrusting us to him. And then that leads us to the second fill in the blank. The second fill in the blank is this. Having bumpy roads does not mean that you're doing it wrong. Because one of the things that we tend to do is when we have bumpy roads is to think, I must be doing parenting all kinds of wrong. Or I'm doing marriage all kinds of wrong. And that's not to say that we don't need wisdom and we don't need to learn and improve. But just because you have bumpy roads doesn't mean you're necessarily doing it wrong. It just means it's part of that process. Sometimes things are clear-cut, what's wrong, and that people do things wrong. Like, so for instance, I'll give you some photos of some things that are being done wrong. Like this guy's doing this wrong, you know. I don't know if you can see him tucked up under that truck, you know, with a 2x4 holding it up. Yeah, he's doing it wrong. This guy's doing it wrong. He's about to get a saw blade right in the spot. Yeah, he's doing it wrong. These guys are doing it wrong. You've got the power strip in the water. Now, did you not see the power strip? That was a power strip. Now, notice these are all men. These are all men doing this stuff. I have no pictures of ladies. I typed in dangerous things, and all I got was men, you know. So this is a man deciding to cut the shrubs, right? I don't know, can you see him up on his lawnmower cutting the shrubs? He's being held up by a crane, you know. Yeah, we've got, hey, I can move the couch, you know. Here, just toss it over the edge. I'll catch it, you know. And then, yeah, I can fix the wire, you know. Let me lay a ladder on top of the wire. I'll fix it. Yeah. That's doing it wrong, you know. Just because you have issue with your 7th grader, just because you have bumpy roads with your 11th grader, just because you're having potty training issues, just because you have some financial challenges in your home, just because you have some bumpy roads doesn't mean you're doing it wrong. It just means that you have a family. Okay? Let me push into that. You have a family of humans. I'll give you one of my favorite verses. This is one of my favorite verses in the Bible. It comes from Proverbs chapter 14, verse 4. And you're going to read it and you're going to think, well, why is that a favorite verse for him? For years, this verse has spoken to me. It says, where there are no oxen, the manger is empty, but from the strength of an ox comes an abundant harvest. Let me push into that. It's two things. There's only two conclusions here. Do you or don't you want to harvest? Because if you want to harvest, you can't have the same pattern. Like if you want a clean barn, then you can't have oxen. But if you don't have oxen, you will not have a harvest. So if you want to clean, I don't want to deal with poop, don't want to deal with feed, I don't want to deal with flies, I don't want to deal with anything, then that's fine. You can have clean, but you will not have a harvest. But if you want to harvest, the only way that you're going to get harvest is by having animals. You're going to have some oxen in order to plow your ground so that you can sow your seed. The only way to have a harvest is to have your oxen. And if you have oxen, guess what? You're going to have poop, you're going to have flies, you're going to have dung, you're going to have feed, you're going to have mess on your hands. When you look at your family, sometimes it's like, I want the clean of everything and I want the harvest. It doesn't work that way. And that's not a prayer that you can lob to God and get him to say, okay, I'll change the script just for you. If you want the blessing of the family, you're going to have oxen and all that comes with it. If you have family in any regard, being you're married, you have kids, or your kids are having kids, or any of that, there is this reality that there are going to be bumps along the way, and it doesn't mean that you're necessarily doing it wrong. It doesn't mean that God isn't with you. But I want you to have wisdom on this third one. The third thing I want you to fill in the blank is this. Despite days of frustration, decide to protect years of damage. Despite the days of frustration, determine, resolve to protect against years of damage. Because you're going to have days that they drive you nuts. Your spouse drives you nuts. You're driving them nuts. And there was a long moment. I'm not even touching that one. Somebody was about to testify. Yeah. But there are going to be those days of frustration. And in those days of frustration, we can say or do things that create years of damage. You can say and do something to your spouse in a day of frustration that creates years of damage. I'm mad at you, so I'm going to go do something, and our marriage won't survive what you did on the day of frustration. You're with your kids, and your kids frustrate you, and you say something that scars them. It doesn't just adjust them. It doesn't just reprove them. It scars them. What you said went so deep, it scarred who I am as a young man trying to grow up and figure a way out, or as a young woman not recognizing whether I'm beautiful to you or not. And you've got to determine in the days of frustration, I'm not going to do years of damage. Now, how do you do this? I don't mean to be so simplistic. But you've got to choose in those days, you've got to choose to love. You've got to choose to love. Now, here's what I mean by that, because that seems like such a generic statement. The Apostle Paul makes a statement about love that I think is incredibly fantastic. In 1 Corinthians 13, he talks about love, and we'll put it on the screen. As you can see, there are a number of words highlighted in yellow. And you've been to a wedding, and you've heard people say this: love is patient, love is kind, love is not rude, love is all these things, right? I want to push into something as we read this. I want you to read it with one thing in mind as you look at it. That Paul is depicting that the opposite behavior is available as well. That when you're in that day of frustration, impatience is as available as patience is. Being unkind is as available and maybe even more natural than being kind. In that day of frustration, it's a choice that I'm not going to be impatient, I'm going to be patient. In that day of frustration, I'm going to be kind. I'm not going to be rude. I'm not going to envy. In this day of frustration, I'm not going to keep the record of wrongs, although it would be really easy right now to just create a litany of complaints with my kids or with my spouse or whatever. In the day of frustration, I'm going to make sure that I'm not delighting in evil. I'm going to rejoice with truth. I'm going to push into that. In the day of frustration, look at these last two lines. I'm going to protect versus harming. It'd be so easy to push into this conflict and push into my anger and frustration. But I'm not going to do that. In the day of frustration, it would be really, really easy not to trust him. Because I trusted you and you defied my trust. You broke it. In the day of frustration, it'd be really easy to lose hope in you. Because I'm frustrated right now. And I thought if I had a perfect environment and I thought you were the perfect spouse, I thought you were my, you were my everything. And now I've lost hope. In the day of frustration, you choose to trust and you choose to hope. It's at this kind of angle that it says that love will persevere and love will never fail. See, my challenge for us in our families, in our marriage, whatever context you're in, whatever tension you have at home, the bumpy road, please don't turn that on God. God, you're unfair to us. Please don't turn that to God. God, you're our rescue away from the bumps. You will eliminate a bump in our road. You'll create a smooth path all the time. That's not always the case. Sometimes he will and sometimes he won't. But the bumps are not an indication that he's not with you. They're not necessarily an indication that you're doing it wrong. We have to be like Paul. I know in whom I've believed, and I can entrust my kids to him. I can entrust my family to him. I can entrust my marriage to him. And in that process, in that day of frustration, I'm going to protect against creating years of damage. I'm going to choose love when the opposite of love is available. I think we start landing on that question that we started off with. What would a great parent do? Because in those moments, maybe you don't feel like a great parent or you don't feel like a great spouse. It becomes a powerful question. What would a great parent do here? And I think all of us would say a great parent would trust in the Lord. A great parent would entrust their family to the Lord. A great parent would choose to love in this moment. And so based on that, let's love our families. Let's love our spouse. Let's love our kids. Let's love the ones that are around us. And let's let God do a special work, even if it's not eliminating the bumps. Even if he's transitioning and transforming us in the process. I think it becomes a very, very powerful thing. This morning, all across the room, I wanted us to take a moment to pray. Because I know in a room this size, we have lots of different families and lots of different family types and lots of different bumpy roads. Some are just, some you've got potholes. You would define your teenager as a pothole, not a bump, And you're like, oh my gosh, But just before we leave this morning, I want us to entrust our family, and not just our family members. See, maybe you've gone through a divorce and you say, I don't have a spouse that I'm entrusting to the Lord, but you have kids that you're entrusting to the Lord. Or maybe you're a family of one. You're a single person, but you want to be married one day. You're a family of one, and you'll need to have some of this wisdom as you go. And you can entrust yourself to the Lord right now, and you can entrust the family that God may give you to him right now. Maybe it's just you're trying to adopt kids, and that's a family that you're trusting the Lord. You can say, in whom I've believed and what I'm entrusting to you. So all across the room, I wanted us to take a moment, and in our mind, let's entrust our families to the Lord. Father, this morning we come before you all across this room. And I thank you. I thank you, Father, that you are with us, and you love us, and you meet us. God, you are the perfect Father. There is no error or sin or missing of the mark in you. And yet still we sometimes create bumpy roads with our relationship by our own choices. And you still love us, and you still embrace us, and you never abandon us because sometimes we miss the mark. Lord, would you let us use that as a picture of how we can parent as well? That we'll love our kids even through the bumps. that we'll love our spouses even through the bumps. Lord, we ask, Father, that you'd help us in whatever family context we're in, that we'd have wisdom for the day, we'd have courage and strength to persevere, and above all things, we could choose love and demonstrate that in a way that is honoring to you and protects years of damage from our family members. Lord, right now we entrust ourselves to you. This morning, before we're dismissed, every head bowed, eyes closed, maybe you've never yielded your life to the Lord. But you say, Joel, I want to do that today. I'm going to say a very quick prayer. But if you say, Joel, I want to follow the Lord with my life, I'd love to have you just pray with me and just say this. Say, Jesus, I give you my life today. I'm acknowledging that you love me. I'm acknowledging, Jesus, that you died for me, that I could have a brand new life along with forgiveness of sin. And so today I receive that. I also invite you to lead me from this day forward. Show me what it is to follow you. And would you be lifted up in my life? Jesus, we thank you for our time this morning. Would you bless your people in an amazing way? We love you so, so much. In Jesus' mighty name. And everybody said, amen. Amen.